We're delighted to give an overview today, and Taalin, my colleague, as I put in the chat, is going to be doing this with me. We're delighted to give you an overview of our newest food waste model governance tool that we developed, of course, in collaboration with NRDC. For those of you who are already familiar, you'll recall these are intended to provide resources and build the capacity of local governments to take action to address food waste. Basically, we're trying to reduce the transaction costs required for busy municipal staff and community groups to develop or just basically start from scratch to develop a new ordinance or policy. Now, what is going on with this? I'm not seeing the slides. Are you all seeing the slides? Here are the slides. Awesome. So Taalin, if you would go to the next slide. So we do not need to review the facts on the slide with this group, but I do have to say I like to occasionally remind myself that we throw away up to 40% of our food because just sort of remembering that really helps energize me about why this work is so important when you focus on things like the incredible amount of natural resources and other implications of wasting that much food. Go to the next slide. So we included this next slide because at least in the world of environmental law that I am in, food waste reduction, I think quite literally maybe one of the only issues that I can think of that has spanned Democratic and Republican administrations in what I think is one of the most polarized eras that we've had. And particularly for cities in states like Tennessee, where I am based in Nashville, is just encouraging to find an issue that isn't so controversial and that is a great candidate for advancing sustainability. So with that very brief intro, I'm going to hand it over to Taalin to do a few background slides on composting, community composting. And again, probably entirely unnecessary for this group, but Taalin, over to you to do a quick overview.
Yeah, sure. So again, probably don't need to go too far into depth of what composting is, but it's the process of recycling organic matter into a valuable soil amendment that can enrich soil and improve plant growth. As you all know, it's an important component of the EPA's wasted food scale, and it's a important complement to other food waste reduction strategies. It can occur across a spectrum of sites and operational scales, from backyard composting to community composting to large industrial facilities. And as we mentioned, community composting is the focus of our model today. Okay, there we go. Okay, so what is community composting? When thinking about how to define community composting in our model, we wanted to recognize that community composting may look different in size and in design across the wide variety of the municipalities in the United States. From, a community composting facility in Manhattan might look different from one in a suburb of Nashville to a more rural town in Illinois. So we intentionally wanted to keep the definition flexible so that cities could adapt the definition to their local context. But we did pick three key characteristics of a community composting site. The first is that it operates at a smaller scale than an industrial facility. The second is that it sources organic material and uses or distributes that finished compost locally. And the third is that it generally engages community in the composting process. So the benefits of composting generally, again, not something I need to do a super deep dive of, but as you all know, composting and compost use offers a ton of environmental, economic, and social benefits. For example, diverting food and other organic wastes can help reduce methane emissions from local landfills. And according to the EPA, most of methane emissions in local landfills come from wasted food. And because wasted food makes up almost a quarter of solid waste streams, composting can also prevent the construction of new facilities and incinerators, which disproportionately harm environmental justice communities. Now, the benefits of compost use, many of these benefits are for the land. And so the basically like composting, when it is applied to the land, can help decrease the need for chemical fertilizers and pesticides, which are costly, they're energy intensive to produce, and they can also pollute, the land through nutrient runoff. And also has benefits to actual the content of the soil. Its nutrients are improved, and it can also help prevent erosion and conserve water by holding more water in the soil. Um, and that's just a few of the benefits there. Um, the benefits of community composting in particular. So community composting is a particular type of composting that's designed to meet local needs, serve local interests, and engage the community in the process. And so, for example, this can take the form of youth education on food systems and sustainability. It can provide a local green space for community members, especially in places where they're lacking green space. And it can also serve as a site for job training and to provide local jobs. Um, in addition, by keeping the process and product local, community composters are able to run a pretty efficient process. They minimize transportation and distribution costs, and they also are able to promote equity by allowing their community members to share in the benefits of the process. So now I'll pass it back to Linda.
Great. So now that we know all the great things about community composting, let's turn to this new model. So this new model is about removing barriers to community composting that's presented by really common local government land use zoning approaches. This slide has a little background on zoning. There's more information in the background memo that accompanies the model. But most localities typically use what is known as Euclidean zoning, right? So this includes establishing zoning districts in different categories, and the typical ones are residential, commercial, industrial, and agriculture. And then you regulate the land use in each of those categories. So if you go to the next slide. As I said, the purpose of the model is to remove potential zoning code barriers by amending the most common type of zoning code, so that communities can realize all the benefits that Taalin just talked about. So basically what the model ordinance does is establish community composting as a distinct land use, right? So community composting is not treated like industrial scale composting or other types of municipal solid waste management and disposal, because those kinds can trigger regulations that really just aren't needed and present a barrier to starting community composting projects or facilities. And it just kind of makes sense that you'd want to impose restrictions on the very large facilities that you wouldn't want to impose on the smaller community composting ones. So is this going back to you, Taalin, now on just sort of how we developed the model?
Sure, yeah. So I can talk a little bit about how the process of how we actually develop the model. The first is that the model is based on extensive research and best practices. So it was a multi-step process. The first was to conduct an extensive policy and literature review in which ELI analyzed relevant legal and academic research, state laws, municipal ordinances, and non-binding policy resources such as plans, reports, and program descriptions to glean relevant best practices and language that could inform the model. The second step was conducting qualitative interviews with experts in the field. This includes legal scholars as well as people on the ground doing community composting, which help distill ideas about the various efficient and effective approaches to advancing community composting through zoning, specifically like what are the biggest zoning barriers to community composting and how do we sort of navigate those. On the basis of this review and the ideas that came out of the interviews, we ELI with NRDC then identified best practices and alternative approaches that would inform the model's actual language. And then after drafting the model language, the commentaries, and the background memo, ELI and NRDC consulted several experts to review and provide feedback on the model, which was then incorporated into the final versions. So that was the process how it came about. And again, like I said, the model is intentionally designed to be able to be tailored to the needs of individual municipalities, and as such is accompanied by a version with commentaries to provide insights into possible alternative approaches to various provisions. There's also a background memo that provides additional information and a slide deck that we are using today, which is also available. And I also want to note that the model draws from and builds on an earlier model zoning template developed by the U.S. Composting Council. And also want to make sure that we mention that we relied on the Institute for Self-Reliance, ILSR, extensive resources and experience in drafting the model. And I'll pass it back over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Helen. And really, so much great work has already been done in this space, and ILSR and the U.S. Composting Council were incredibly helpful in our developing this model. So if you go to the next slide, okay, so what does this thing say? As a threshold matter, the model makes community composting a permissible land use in all of those zoning districts that I mentioned. However, not all districts are treated the same. So in commercial and industrial zones, community composting is considered what's called a primary use, and it's by right. You don't have to get any, special permission. Similarly, in agricultural zones, community composting is established by right, but it's called an accessory use. And this is just a term in land use law for activities on a property that are sort of subordinate to, but related to the main use, in this case, agriculture. And then in residential and mixed use zones, and a caveat here. So this latter zoning type, mixed use, is increasingly being incorporated into the Euclidean zoning framework to allow for more than one use in a zone, such as residential and commercial. And of course, we're seeing that in a lot of urban areas now. So for residential and mixed use zones, the ordinance makes community composting permissible, but a conditional use permit is required, and more on that in just a minute. Also, just worth noting that the model ordinance establishes community composting as an accessory use to permitted urban agriculture and community gardens. And that just makes sense because often urban ag and community gardens already have composting going on. If you can go to the next slide, please. It's important to note that even though community composting is a permissible use, in all cases, it cannot receive, handle, or store hazardous or toxic waste, biosolids, or any non-organic material. If we go to the next one. Okay, so let's turn to the conditional use standards for residential and mixed use zones, because that's really kind of the hardest or most challenging part of this. So conditional use permitting is a standard feature of municipal zoning. It's applied to a range of activities, not just community composting, has been for a long time. The concept is that you impose conditions that make the use of the land compatible with the other land uses in that district. So the activity at issue here, community composting, is not permitted as a matter of right, but only if certain conditions are met. So what this means is that there are certain checks basically on community composting facilities in residential and mixed zones. So specifically what we did in this model was to say, you can operate a community composting facility, but you have to submit a plan that has certain components or includes certain information. So the plan must show the location of the structures, the bins, the loading areas. It's got to demonstrate that there's landscaping that's going to buffer the facility from residential properties. You have to demonstrate in the plan that the facility will not negatively impact surface water, groundwater, floodplains, and the plan must address potential odor, pest control, and traffic impacts. And then it's also important to note that any other requirements on the books that might apply to facilities in that district, so setback requirements or bulk requirements, for example, would apply to the community composting facility as well. One of the issues we really wrestled with, we had a lot of back and forth with experts in developing the model, was just how prescriptive to be in terms of the conditional use permit. But based on a lot of input, particularly from Institute for Local Self-Reliance, we decided to go with what you might call performance-based standards in order to allow flexibility for community composters. So we didn't say you have to do X, Y, and Z best practices, but you do have to make sure there's no odor, et cetera. You have a performance standard. And at the same time, we felt like this would address concerns of neighbors about odors, for example. Okay. Yeah, so this is just another really important point that community composting has to apply with any other applicable municipal, state, and federal laws. This could be obtaining permits in some cases, and it could also, definitely also includes avoiding creating a public or private nuisance. And, the standard for nuisance might vary from state to state, but basically the community composting operation can't interfere with the use or enjoyment of another's property or with the public's enjoyment of the surrounding area. Okay, we're getting toward the end here. Do want to make sure, to be clear, that this ordinance does not apply to backyard composting. The scale of backyard composting is typically much smaller, and the food waste is processed on the residential site, and usually the compost is just used in that same residential location. So we just want to be clear about that. And then lastly, the model ordinance also provides for the local planning department or other entity to incorporate community composting as a permissible use in any comprehensive plan. And as you know, comprehensive plans, sometimes they're called master plans, are plans that establish overarching development goals for the local government and serves as a basis for the more detailed land use regulation in a locality. So where possible, we really want that overarching plan, the comprehensive plan, to recognize the value of community composting and help make sure that it is a permissible land use. Taalin, you want to wrap this up with just a couple of additional slides on where to find all of this?
Sure. Yeah, I'll quickly cover this. Basically, like I mentioned before, we really wanted to make sure that municipalities can tailor this to their context. For example, this could mean that the model ordinance could be modified to require a municipal engineering review for proposed community composting facilities, or modify the conditional use standards. It could establish a quantitative threshold instead of the more flexible definition. But yeah, I'll move on now. Okay. And yeah, just some additional resources, information to wrap it up. The model ordinance comes with 4 different resources: the version with commentaries, without commentaries, an accompanying background memo, and a copy of this presentation. And I'll link this in the chat afterwards, but they all can be found at the NRDC landing page. There are also some helpful sources, and resources linked to this presentation. And for more information, you can feel free to contact Linda, me, or Darby. And Linda, any final words?
Yeah. So thanks so much for listening. And also want to give you a heads up that community composting model ordinance number 2 is also in the works, and that's going to be another collaboration with NRDC and also with Institute for Local Self-Reliance. And this next ordinance is going to look at removing other types of barriers aside from zoning, but also ways to provide incentives for community composting. So there'll be provisions on perhaps technical assistance or grant programs or public education programs that will all help advance community composting efforts. And also a final reminder that we've done several other models related to food waste with NRDC, and we'll put a link to those in the chat. The end.